So thank you so much for joining, and I'm so excited to welcome Maya. Maya, do you want to say a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself for those who might not know you already?
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. Thank you for tuning into the chat today. I am here to talk about grief. You might already know, but my mum died when I was 9, so I'll be talking more about that. But in terms of my general life, I was brought up in Barnsley, which is in the north of England. So if you notice, I've got a bit of a slight Yorkshire accent, that's probably why. And then I went to uni in Manchester, and then I was a retail manager for a while. And I worked in domestic abuse. I'm a trained hypnotherapist. And so mental health is like a really big part of my life, which is why I feel so passionate about talking about grief. And most recently, I do a lot of anti-racism and decolonizing work. So for those of you who might follow me on Instagram, that's kind of the general theme of my life at the moment and could be for years to come. So that's kind of me in a very small nutshell.
Thank you, Maya. And for those of you who don't already know, Maya has written this absolutely beautiful book that I feel so privileged to have a copy of, because even just holding it is such a lovely experience. Like, the cover is so soft, and it's just fantastic. So it's called Half Woman, Half Grief. We will, at the end of the session, pop the link to purchase a copy in the chat. So if you do like the sound of it, I can highly recommend it. So do grab a copy. So we'll talk about that, and Maya, you're going to read us a few poems later. But I just wanted to start by hearing a little bit more about your grief journey and that sort of story. So you, as you said, you lost your mum. Her name was Nutan. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, I actually don't even pronounce it properly myself because I don't have the Gujarati accent to go with it. So it's something I always feel very guilty about.
Great, well, do forgive me, because I'm sometimes bad with this, but I mean, she just sounds like the most radiant person, just the most beautiful woman and amazing mother to you. So do you mind just sharing a little bit about her so we can get to know her?
Sure, thank you. So she was born in 1961 in Kisumu, Kenya, to an Indian Gujarati family. So Gujarat is the northwest of India, so that's where our family originates from. And so she was brought up in Kisumu, and then when she was about 16, she came to England with the family for education. And so, yeah, she was a very social person, very confident, and from what I hear, very extroverted, which is ironic because I am not. So that's somewhere where we differ. She was an amazing mother, and I talk about her in the book in the sense of the safety I felt when I was with her. She was a place of comfort and peace for me, and she was also quite fiery at the same time. I knew she would fight for me if needed. And one of the most amazing things, which I think is quite remarkable, and I think I took it for granted at the time, was I always wanted to be a writer, and I always wanted to publish a book. And I'm talking like from the age of like 7, I was very clear about that.
Wow.
So she actually sent my work to publishers at the age of 8 because she believed in me so much.
Amazing.
And I don't even know if it crossed her mind that these publishers would be like, no. But it was just like that act of sheer belief in me. And that's something that, despite the difficult years since, I've used as an anchor, which has helped me start believing in myself again, because she believed in me so much.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. And I just love that that's, you spoke there about safety and then sort of said, oh, she was quite fiery as well. But that that knowing that she would stand up for you, whatever, really plays into that safety, doesn't it? Because I think especially as we're growing up, and I feel, especially as a young woman with losing a mother, young women go through so many sort of crises of confidence, don't they, and changes and sort of anxieties, that to have a safety net and to have someone who's got your back is so helpful. But obviously for you were just 9 when your mum died, so you sort of knew that you had that, but that she sort of wasn't around anymore in the present. That must have been, it must have been so hard. You told me that you were 9 when she died and just about to turn 10, which is so young. What was that sort of immediate grief like for you? Do you remember much of it? Because you were so young.
Yeah, it's one of those things that was kind of seared in my mind. And I actually remember the lack of grief, in the sense that the night that I found out that she died, I went into a place of shock. And all of our family from different parts of the country drove to be with us. So it was kind of this like alternate state of reality. I kind of went into this other realm in a way. I managed to write a poem for her. I believe it was either that night or the night after. And so I remember it all happening very fast. The funeral day was like 8 days later. And then on my birthday, which is the 23rd of December, we scattered her ashes. And then the reason why I didn't get a chance to grieve properly is because I was sent to live with my grandparents about 2 weeks after my mum died. So I had to leave all my school friends, leave the town I was in, and then go and live in this completely different town, make completely new friends, start a new curriculum. It's mind-blowing now to think that they actually did that to me and my brother. I think it's actually very shocking and not right. But at the time, I think I was just in this coping mode. And so then, because my family aren't equipped to talk about grief, and they've got their own trauma and intergenerational trauma and things like that, we just never spoke about grief. They never spoke to me about it. It was just hidden and buried. And so it was only until about 2 years ago, when my cousin suddenly passed away, that a lot of my buried grief came up. And so, yeah, I didn't actually grieve properly until the last few years, basically.
Yeah.
And I'm 34 next week, so it's about 24 years.
Wow. And I think, we've spoken before. I know some of your story, but that is so shocking, that you were sort of moved away. But also, I think in other ways it doesn't surprise me at all, because I sort of know, how everyone suddenly you suddenly get this trauma happen, and everyone sort of panics, don't they? And they just think, oh gosh, now what happens? And you mentioned that you wrote a poem, really soon, which I think is really beautiful, but also, it's just amazing that you felt, you had the strength to start writing in such a confusing time. But was that a way, I guess, for you to start processing? Because you mentioned, you loved writing, you were already writing. So maybe it felt like quite a natural response for you to just get the pen and paper and just start writing about it.
It really did. It was a natural response. And I found that because I'm a very intense feeling person, as I'm sure you probably have guessed by now. And so that intensity, I wasn't always able to show in real life. And, our society doesn't really encourage like that intensity, especially in a female identifying person. So I hid a lot of that, but when I was writing, that intensity came out. It was just so natural, and I think that's why the book is the way that it is, because all of that intensity that's been building inside me for so long, the rage and the, you know, feelings of talking about shame and just the agonizing pain, and the sort of metaphors that I use. I kind of live in that world a lot. I have like a really rich kind of inner world, and so that all kind of translated onto the page. And so I think often I found that when I used to start sharing my recent poems with people, a lot of my family members were like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Because in my outer life, I don't tend to express myself in that way. And I
Yeah,
was like, yeah, I'm fine. I wrote that like 4 years ago. You know, I'm okay. But I think they thought I was like really depressed or like going through some sort of breakdown. But it's
yeah.
just my natural inner state is just a very intense state.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really interesting that that was something that maybe you had kept inside for such a long time and had only really come out in that poetry. But I wonder if you feel that in writing more and more, it almost enabled you to start sort of living that out in an external way as well. And you touched there as well on the fact that as women, we often, rage isn't particularly like a popular emotion for women, or one that's accepted. So there's a little bit there as well around you sort of getting the confidence to step into an emotion. And I think both men and women will understand there's different emotions that maybe people you sort of need to build the confidence up to let out and to show the world. And I'm just wondering whether you would attribute that sort of process to sort of writing these poems for the book, or whether that was something actually that started sort of years and years ago, when you first started writing, that sort of building of that confidence to really let your true self out into the open.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's funny because I actually studied creative writing at university in Manchester. And so that actually curtailed my rage, because it was very intellectual, and I felt my emotive way of writing wasn't accepted, even though I got decent grades, but it wasn't enough for me, being the
Yeah,
perfectionist that I am. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to write again for 7 years. And when I did start writing very emotively, and I did start writing about rage, but I wasn't sharing it that much with people.
yeah,
But as time went on and I started sharing it more and more on Instagram, and people responded in a really positive way, I found that not only was it validating, but I started to integrate that part of myself, that rage and the shame, because I realized it was just a human, natural process. And I talk about rage a lot now. But I would say that when I published the book and people finally, it was public, people finally could read all of it, I felt like I was free, and that I didn't have to hide anything anymore. It was like I was resurrecting my mum, because she'd been buried for a really long time because no one spoke about her. And so this book was like a resurrecting of her, but then a resurrecting of the part of me that had died when she died. And so, yeah, I guess that's like a roundabout way to answer your question, but
no,
yeah.
that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. And I think I love that word, like resurrecting, because there's real there's lots of different ideas that people who are grieving have about where that loved one is, or how they experience their connection to them. And I just think it's so important to find your own way of bringing that person back into your sort of present day.
Mm.
And for those of us, I noticed there's some people on the call who are in our creative writing about loss group, and so there's lots of people who find that creative writing such a helpful way to sort of gently bring that person back in a I guess as well a controlled way, you know, a way that they can say, okay, this is how I want to bring this person back into the present in a way that I'm comfortable with, and that, you know, isn't too sad or overwhelming sometimes. And that's, yeah, I think the book is such a beautiful tribute to your mum as well. You know, you really she, you know, she shines through it, through you. And there's, I mean, you'll probably touch on this later, but there's lots of moments in the book where I just feel almost like I'm hearing from her, which is such a beautiful thing, because then not only is she back in your life, but she's in my life as well, you know, and all these people who never got the chance to know her, but they are like knowing her through this writing. And I love that. Whoever you've lost, you know, writing about them can sort of keep them alive and keep them in that present moment, rather than it always having to be past tense, or, you know, that person is gone. I'm aware that the time is hurtling past. As always, Maya, I could just chat to you forever and ever and ever. But just to say to everyone, please feel free to ask any questions yourself of Maya. You can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask them out loud. For people who joined since the start, just to let you know that we are recording the session, and we are planning to share that on YouTube afterwards. So do feel that you don't need to come off mute or turn your video on if you're not comfortable with potentially being on YouTube later. Maya, just while people perhaps are thinking of questions or writing them in the chat, I'm just wondering if you have a favourite poem in the book, or one that's particularly, you know, resonating with you at the moment, and if you could treat us all to a reading of it.
Sure. So I have a few favourite poems, but one that came to mind was kind of the theme of what we've been talking about already. So resurrecting my mum's memory, and the part of myself who died when she died, and rage. So I'd like to read that, and it's actually the first poem in the book.
Amazing. I'm going to read along, not out loud, but read along with you.
Welcome to one.
No one needs to hear me read it. You're the expert here.
20 years clawing out of your coffin, resurrecting myself from dust to crawl through mud on bloody hands and knees, screaming the night air right out of my lungs, howling at the moon with streaming tears and thirsty sobs, unchaining my domesticated soul, setting her free, baring my teeth, eyes widened in anger. I now stand here with dirt in my fingernails and your pride in my heart.
Wow, it's fantastic. I adore that line, with dirt in my fingernails. That's sometimes how grief feels, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just absolutely beautiful and
visceral.
Really visceral, yeah. And what I love about it is, not only can you sense the rage, but you can also, there's also almost a real sense of just sort of somber, you know, quiet about it, that there's like all this rage, but it's also, and when you read it then, it's almost a calming poem for me. And I think that's because I relate to it so much of it I'm going, yeah. And so it's actually almost really sort of calming and helpful for me, as well as, you know, being able to sense the real real rage in it, and the real pain in it.
I think it can be very validating, because I think grief has always been very sugar-coated.
Definitely.
Society, and the first line of the back of the book says, "I'm not here to sugarcoat grief, I'm here to be transformed by it." And I think that is essentially what we all need to start doing, because we do feel rage in our grief. We often feel rage towards the person who's died, or we feel rage towards society for not supporting us, or we feel rage towards ourselves for not doing the right thing, or, you know, for hurting that person before they died, or, you know, there's so much rage that we hold, and we've been taught to believe it's such a negative emotion. And so I think for people to hear this, hopefully it gives them permission to feel the rage within themselves.
Definitely. That's so beautiful. Thank you. Bridget's put a comment in the chat, a question. So she's asked, I'm wondering how you find editing your poems, and the journey to publishing some of them. Was it a difficult process because of the subject matter, which I think is so important, isn't it? Because it's such a personal book. Or do you manage to distance yourself from it? And she said, thanks from a fellow person who writes about grief.
Well, thank you very much for your question. So I'll start with the editing process. My poems are intuitive downloads, so I never sit down with the sole purpose to write. I am either woken up in the night, or I'm in the countryside or the forest, and something comes to me, and so the form also comes to me with that. Sometimes there's a bit of tweaking with, like, maybe a word on a different line, but mainly I leave it in the way that it was given to me. So I see myself as a sort of vessel for the poems to come through. And it's very intuitive. So, and I believe, to any poet out there listening, I think poetry is, I don't actually read a lot of other people's poetry, because I believe that it should be very original and true to you. I think sometimes when we focus too much on the form, we can get lost. And to me, it's about a felt sense. It's about translating an emotion onto a page, even if it's within 20 seconds, you just get it out. I think that rawness is actually what has translated into my poems. And so I would advocate that, rather than tweaking something too much, perhaps. And then in terms of writing publishing the book, I was actually quite lucky. So I decided to self-publish because I wanted creative control over the book. But I found a fellow colleague of mine who worked in the mental health charity that I used to work for, who offered to, she's a graphic designer, so she offered to design the book. So because she knew me and she already worked in mental health, and things like grief and everything were very, you know, she wasn't taken aback by any of that.
Yeah.
It was a lot easier, because she kept a very safe holding space for me. I think I would have found it harder if I'd have tried to apply to publishing houses, because it's such a personal, vulnerable book. It's like, if someone rejected me, I'd feel like they were really rejecting me.
Yeah.
So yeah, the process in itself was quite hard. I had to choose the poems, and I had to make sure that the illustrations and everything went well, and that it had a feel for it. I can't really describe it, but everything had to be just right in a sort of, it's a journey, basically. If you read the book, it's a journey into the underworld and then back out again. And so getting the felt sense right was difficult. Yeah, and it was a scary process all in all, because it just is, because you don't know what people are going to think.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that. And I know as well, you mentioned there that your poems are those intuitive downloads. That's such a brave way to write poetry, especially about grief, rage, trauma, your inner being, because I mean, it must have been so terrifying on the day they went live online for other people to buy, because that is, I mean, you are literally bearing your soul, aren't you? And are there any ways that you have found to protect your own sort of you know, your grief and your own sort of feelings, whilst also, because I'm aware, you know, like this evening, you know, you're talking about the book, you must have had to do some promotion for the book as well, so there must be times where you have to sort of disconnect a little, because actually you know, we're all grieving ourselves, aren't we? So you've got to think of your own grief as well as now, you know, the book as a product and the sort of, you know, everyone else reading about your grief as well.
I would say that actually, once I published the book, even though it was terrifying, I actually felt more healed than when I hadn't, because of the nature of my journey where I couldn't talk about it and I felt that no one wanted to discuss it in my family. So it was often more painful to hold it in than it was just to go, here you go,
yeah,
here it all is, you know, go and read it. In a way, having it in a book so that they could go away and read it was a lot easier than me having to talk about it. So
yeah.
it was almost the opposite of what some people might think, because it was, I think when something's in writing, someone can go away, they can like process it themselves, and then they can get back to you, rather than if someone just asked me, you know, about the deep details, I think I'd find that a little bit harder. So it was kind of a different process for me. I found one amazing thing that's happened since the book has come out is certain family members who had previously kept in their grief have started opening up. And that was a really lovely, lovely thing, an amazing gift to give. Through my own sort of pain, I was able to open up theirs a little bit. So that makes it worthwhile as well.
That's amazing. I love that when someone asks you now about your grief, you can just go read the book.
Yeah. Because everything's
take a copy and come back when you've finished. I think that would be quite helpful actually, when someone asks, like, you know, especially when people ask the wrong questions, you can just say, right, here's the book.
Yeah.
Go away, come back to me when you've when you've learned some more.
Exactly.
I love that. Oh, that's amazing. Are there any other poems in the book? I mean, I wish you could just sit here and read the whole book because it's amazing, but we don't want to give too many spoilers away because everyone should get a copy of the book. There's one in particular, if you don't mind, that I just absolutely loved, and I wonder if that's because, I don't know, because it sort of was talking to me, you know, at a specific point, but especially in the book there's a section called the Unraveling, which I just, you know, absolutely loved. And I mean, there's just these stunning illustrations as well, that I think sometimes when it's hard to read, you can just look at the illustrations, can't you, and just get all the beauty. But I just love this. You'll obviously know which it is when I read it out, but years of unspent grief. She crouches in me silently, awaiting her turn, a currency. She readies herself to jump. My throat tightens. I just adore that. And I read it and I was like, wow, Maya is in my own mind. I love that, you know, awaiting her turn, and that sort of sense that grief is always there, and you know, it's literally like in your throat, ready to be like, and now it's my turn. Here I am, and readies herself to jump. I just adore that. And one question I had for you actually around that, a lot of the poetry in your book is you sort of refer to your you know, your grief as her, and I suppose, you know, you're seeing her as part of yourself, but you're not sort of using I or me, you're using sort of her and she. do you sort of see your grief as, you know, almost like a woman that is both part of yourself and also separate to yourself? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but is that how you
do.
How you feel?
So actually, I think of this being that I refer to as her as the dark feminine. So I mentioned the dark feminine in the introduction, and for those who might not be aware of the dark feminine, it's like a sort of energy that, so the light feminine is kind of like a woman, say embodied in a woman, it would be a woman who is very, very smiley and genuinely feels a lot of light, and has a very sort of more cheerful disposition. And if the dark feminine was a woman, it would be like a kind of crone, or like a witch, or like a woman who holds those like darker energies. It doesn't mean she's any less loving, she's just a bit more fierce. And she, if anyone's heard of the goddess Kali, or there's Hecate, you know, there's these kind of dark feminine archetypes. And so that is a huge energy that I believe I carry. And so I think of her as this archetype, because me expressing my grief and my rage is more of this energy coming into the world. And I believe this energy is needed for many things, like justice, calling people out, you know, expressing female rage. And so like protecting the earth, you know, people like that. So I actually think of her as the dark feminine, who is within me, but also within all beings.
Yeah, I love that. And it's just such a powerful and interesting and really relatable way for me. Certainly, I can't speak for everyone who's read the book, but just for me, feeling that she's there and she's part of me, but she's also not my whole self. She is sort of a part of me that, and people will be nodding along even without their cameras on, sometimes comes out at the wrong moments, or, you know, sometimes sort of spills out, but actually deserves to, because you know, it's totally acceptable in our own grief to feel real rage, or to feel real hurt and pain and sadness. And it's simply society sort of you know, telling us to, you know, keep that in. And, you know, grief is just the sort of single tear rolling down the cheek image, which certainly is not reflective of how I grieve.
No.
I don't know how anyone manages a single tear. With me, as soon as the first one comes, that's it. It's never ending.
Which feels really good though. You know, when you're going through it, it's like this very cathartic, visceral, like a whole body experience. And I think every time that happens to me, which happens a lot, about different things, not just my mum, but, you know, we all grieve for a lot of things going on in the world. But I always feel so like light afterwards, so cleansed.
Yeah.
And I believe our tears are there to do that. So, you know, I hope society really reflects one day what real grief actually looks like.
Yeah, definitely. Me too. I wonder, were there any poems in the book that were particularly difficult for you, maybe not necessarily to write, but to you know, just to feel as they sort of came to you, or difficult to publish perhaps? And, you know, I know you said that it was so helpful once you sort of all just got it out and got it down on paper, but were there any aspects of that process that were really difficult, that made you sort of wonder, oh, I'm not sure about this one, or I'm not sure about those feelings or those words that have come to me?
There was definitely one that I added much later than all the others, because I wrote it later. And to me, I knew that family members reading it would know it was about them.
Okay.
It's about denying and dismissing my grief and my feelings, and it's a very angry poem. So that it's the second poem in the book, and I knew I had to add it, but it was quite a, I knew it would be a bit, to start the book with that, it was kind of like, whew, you know, a lot of this is because of your actions and your behavior, and I'm just going to tell the world now. And the poem actually ends with, like, now I must tell the whole world, because they weren't, telling them wasn't enough, basically. They didn't seem to care, in my opinion. So that was a very deep wounding that I had. And I think grief, for some people, grief is very straightforward, but mine sort of transmuted into CPTSD because of the treatment that my family gave afterwards. So it kind of became very complex. So the poems in the book sometimes represent that complexity as well, where it's not just grieving for mum, it's more like abuse or, you know, things like that on top of it. But I'm sure there's many people who have to go through that. So I'm glad I could translate some of that into the book as well.
Yeah, because it's so helpful for others to read, and realise that they're not alone in that. Yeah, that's beautiful. If anyone does have any questions for Maya, do feel free to pop them in the chat. We'd be so happy to ask and answer them. Maya, I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind doing just one more reading for us. If there's, oh wait, it doesn't have to be one more, as you know, I'd listen to the whole book. But is there another poem that you'd like to share with us and maybe tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, sure. So I think I will read, I was talking about the dark feminine, so I'll read one of my favorites in the book, which is about how death sort of strengthened me.
Amazing.
Through the dark feminine. So, okay. You loved me from the shadows, nourished me with death, taught me to raise my voice from a whisper to a growl, taught me to say my own name clearly, to straighten my spine into a warrior's, showed me love didn't have to be gentle to be right, caressed me fiercely, knowingly, smothered me with the truth, blessed my rage. You shot the stars out of the sky, taught me how to find light in the darkness.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to listen to you read them as well, because it's how they're meant to be heard, isn't it? From you yourself reading them. That's a really beautiful poem. When did that come to you? Because I know you mentioned that some of the poems, one was written later. When have you been writing these for years, or did they come from a particular time, in your grief journey?
So I'd actually come out of a really difficult relationship with an ex-partner. So this was about 5 years ago, and I hadn't written for 7 years after uni. And I decided, or maybe it was an intuitive feeling, that I had to write again. And so I started writing. And so a lot of these poems came out in that time period following this breakup. And yeah, so just over the next 5 years, I just kept writing. And so the book, actually, I never sat down to write the book. The poems had already been written. And so it was like, I just needed to pick which ones felt right to be in the book, which was a difficult process in itself. But once again, intuition sort of guided me into which ones wanted to be seen at that point and which ones didn't. And that one, I think, was more of a recent one, where I was really integrating that dark feminine aspect of myself and being like, actually, this has taught me a lot, and I'm more fierce and ferocious, and I've learned about what love can be, which is, it can be fierce, it can be harsh, but in a good way, and my rage can be blessed, because my rage is valid too. And so, a lot of people who might know me from my Instagram account can see that in real time, like you know, a loving rage. So yeah, I really feel like death did teach me that too.
Yeah, definitely. There's something about grief as well, isn't there, that you are catapulted into this realization that of that, like, you know, that darker side to life. And especially when you're bereaved at such a young age, you sort of go from this like innocent
Mm.
sort of world into suddenly seeing all of that side, and that real actually adult realization that like you said, love has a harsher side, and that actually death can teach us a lot, and from death can come a lot of beauty and growth and new life. That, yeah, maybe just sort of, you know, if someone had tried to tell you that before you were bereaved, be thinking, what on earth are they talking about? You know, that doesn't make any sort of logical sense. But once you have experienced that grief, it all just sort of makes sense in your mind, doesn't it?
Totally. And I think, and I've said this to my partner only recently, I believe that when my mum died, I was plunged into the underworld. And just like Persephone in the Greek myths, like I've always kind of been there, even if it's half of the year there and half of the year not. It's like when anyone else is bereaved, I feel like I'm already there, and I've got my little cabin in the underworld, and I've got my lights on, and I'm like, welcome, I've been waiting for you for a really long time. Welcome to my world. I can help you because I've been here, you know. And even though as a child the illusion of happiness was sadly shattered, and you know, it was very hard to feel excitement and joy. Even now I struggle, because it was such a fundamental time for me. And you expect your mother to be there. That's what you're told, and that's what you feel is right. So to have the rug swept from under my feet, it's like I was experiencing the world in this completely different way to all of my peers. And in the introduction I say it was like I was shot in the leg with an invisible bullet, but I was trying to still run a race with my peers, but I had this invisible wound that was just like gaping and bleeding, and I was limping, and I was like, why am I not excited? Why am I not feeling joyful? But I also do think it's because I wasn't supported by the adults around me to heal, because I would have understood more. Like, oh, I'm not joyful because I lost my mum and this is why. But at the time I just kept trying to run that race. And it's only recently that I realized, oh my God, like I couldn't even, what was I doing? Like I wasn't in the race. Like, this is like, if this was a physical wound, people would be like, you need to be in hospital. You know? So it's terrible. Like it is terrible that this is how society still is, basically.
Yeah. And that misunderstanding of, you know, like you said, you were just sort of sent away to a new place and a new school and new friends, which anyone on this call who's been bereaved knows what you really need is stability. You need, you know, people who know what's happened and so aren't asking awkward questions, or, you know, you need to be in a safe place. And added, you know, all of that would have been impossible if you'd been an adult. Add on top of the fact that you just turned 10 years old, you know, like, oh my gosh, of course you're not going to know how to deal with it. And anyone who's on the call who was bereaved at a very young age, like yourself, will know that it does take such a long time to really get everything just get everything in your mind to make sense, because you're just a child with a very limited understanding, without any autonomy over, you know, your own decisions or anything, because everyone, you know, the adults in your life are making them for you. And I was 20 when my mum died, and I still felt so childlike and so vulnerable in that place, and yet technically in the eyes of the law I was an adult, you know. Yeah, Tina's just said in the chat that she was 8 when her mum died. She's now 28, and Phil, you only just started your grief journey. And Tina, I mean, so sorry to hear that, but also I think that's so normal, isn't it? You know, that's so many people's experience, that it's not until adulthood. Also, I sort of feel like your brain, you know, we talk about that shock phase. For me, my brain is still sometimes in that shock phase.
Yeah.
And so your brain just takes so long. And I don't think it'll ever get to a point where it'll be like, right, I know what happened. You know, still, only last night I had a dream that my mum was in, and I woke up and had that horrible realization that so many of us have all the time. Oh, mum died. You know, that, oh, I'm awake. That was a dream. She's not still here. You know, it's just so painful, isn't it?
So painful and so bizarre to get your head around. It's almost absurd. It's like someone is physically there one day and then suddenly they're just not anymore. And it's just like this cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
It's just a very weird thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Tina's just said it's a real breath of fresh air to relate to what you've said, Maya. So that's so wonderful. And I'm really glad to hear you say that, Tina, because I think it's so important, isn't it? Conversations like this that are some, you know, they are challenging to have. You know, I'm so thankful for you for chatting to us and for sharing some of your poetry, because it's not easy to do that. And it's so helpful. And I just think, gosh, I wish, you know, when my mum had died, I could have dialed into a Zoom like this, and I would have been like, wow, you know, I'm learning so much from this amazing, wise woman about grief. You know, I loved what you said as well about about when you're in the underworld and someone joins, you know, welcome.
Yeah, it's like a little community.
Yeah, and I sort of feel like, oh gosh, it's awful that you're here. But actually, it's not, you know, it's not so bad. We've made, you know, we've planted some flowers, you know, we've made it nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, that we're able to sort of speak up, so that when people enter this horrible world, they can take a little bit of a breath by, you know, meeting someone else in this. And actually, I think that's why this book is just so fantastic, because, you know, for someone, you mentioned, you know, it's a book full of rage. So potentially there's some people who might, you know, not want to read it on day one of grief.
Yeah.
But I also think it's so helpful just for people to have it as a bit of as that sort of safety net that you were talking about at the start, you know, that safety of, oh, thank goodness it's not just me. Yeah. Thank goodness someone has trodden these waters before me, because I have no idea what I'm doing or where I'm going. And, you know, at least someone has been here and written some really helpful things about what it's like.
And that's why I wrote it as well. It wasn't just a testament to my mum or myself, which it is both of those, but it was also, hey, look, if anything good can come out of the journey that I've taken and the naturally introspective person that I am, an intense person that I am, I want to be able to hold the hand metaphorically for other people in that journey to the underworld, because you will go to the underworld. That is a given. You know, anyone who's experienced grief, whether you want to look at it or not, you're going to be in the underworld, whether you know it or not. And so it's like, let's make this conscious. And, you know, I've lived to tell the tale. It's safe. It's okay. The worst that's going to happen is you will have some rage and you will have some sobbing, you know, but
we can deal with that.
In the rage, you'll get back up. And you'll probably feel a lot better, and then it might come again in about 5 days' time, and you know you'll be okay because you were okay the first time.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Maya, I can't believe the time I just think, oh my gosh, where does the time go when I'm chatting to you? It's just such a joy and such a privilege.